11 years ago, I entered my own recovery. I realized I needed to change a lot of things in my life because things were working and they were okay, but I felt incredibly unsatisfied. I didn't feel like my potential or purpose was being fulfilled. So when I came into recovery, it gave me an opportunity to kind of reevaluate who I wanted to be in the world and where I wanted to help.
Welcome, everybody, to Rebuilding Trust with Carol the Coach. And I'm really excited today to be talking to Mel McCracken, who is a specialist in part because of everything she has done for the community. She is the National Director of Chemsex and LGBT programs. And I love her recovery program center. It's called No Matter What Recovery. It's straight out of Los Angeles, and you've really made it your mission, and you are the face of educating people about chemsex and about the LGBTQ community and how sometimes problematic sexual behavior and chemsex merge or feed into each other. So, Mel, so glad to have you here today. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Carol. I'm so happy to be here with you today.
Yeah, one of the funnest things about this podcast is I get to meet other professionals in the world and get to learn about them and get to learn about what they're doing. And so before I ask you what chemsex is, I want to ask you, how did you get into this field?
That is a very good question, Carol. Well, I will say about 11 years ago, I entered my own recovery. And
Mm.
I realized that in doing so, I needed to change a lot of things in my life because things were working and they were okay, but I felt incredibly unsatisfied. I didn't feel like my potential or purpose was being fulfilled. So when I came into recovery, it gave me an opportunity to kind of reevaluate who I wanted to be in the world and where I wanted to help. And so I landed, working at a treatment center that was LGBTQ focused. And I had a very personal and very professional interest in helping my community recover from chemsex addiction.
Very good. So you see that this can be an epidemic in that community.
Well, I mean, I'm so glad you said that word because that's actually what we're seeing. It is this kind of very quiet, very silent epidemic that is really ripping families apart, destroying relationships. And, at the end of the day, in worst case, a lot of people are dying, right? From chemical addiction. So, we had the HIV crisis and, nothing will compare to that, but this is a slow burn in the underbelly of our connection with one another in the community and our
Mhm.
relationships with one another, and it is an epidemic.
Mhm. So then when did you get trained at ITAP, the organization that, for anybody who doesn't know, certifies sex addiction therapists and pastors, religious people? When did you get trained?
So I think my journey with ITAP actually started in 2017, maybe 2018. Um,
Uh-huh.
there was not a lot of education available about how to help people with chemsex. So
Hmm.
I was like, all right, well, ITAP seems to be a really valuable resource, especially around learning how to set boundaries, our circles plans, and things like that I was kind of already doing, but I just needed more guidance. So, I I spoke with I think it was Tammy at ITAP a very long time ago, and we just began the journey there.
Okay.
Hmm.
Well, again, I welcome you because this is a relatively new field. And I did use the word epidemic. I use that even with problematic sexual behavior, with availability, anonymity, and accessibility being so prevalent.
Hmm.
People are getting involved and they don't understand how it can hijack their brain. And then if they're merging it with chemicals or substances on top of it,
Hmm.
they go hand in hand to create an addiction an addiction like no other. So
Right.
tell me a little bit, and our listening audience,
Hmm.
what is chemsex?
So chemsex is kind of on the lines of what you just said, where there's maybe problematic sexual behavior and then there's ongoing substance abuse. But with the substance abuse, it's mainly used to facilitate extended sexual sessions, sometimes with multiple partners at parties and things like that. So people use substances to try and keep the high going, so to speak.
Mhm.
But what begins to happen is we are no longer dealing with someone who has substance use disorder and problematic sexual behavior. They're not co-occurring at this point. If they've been used over time, collectively, they become their own addiction. And people really struggle to use substances without sex or to have sex without substances, because if it fires together, it wires together. So it becomes its own addiction like no other. And I will say that predominantly, when I talk about chemsex, I'm referring and coining that term for the LGBTQ community, because that term was actually first used in the UK for specifically men who have sex with men. So I just kind of reserved that. But I want to say um, chemsex transcends the LGBTQ community, right? And it moves into this place of sexualized drug use or, sex under the influence for many people. It is genderless, it is orientationless, and it is something that I think many people are vulnerable to if they struggle with compulsive behaviors around sex or even substance use disorder.
Okay. I've always wanted to know from the experts a question that has, I don't think, anything to do with chemsex, but one of the populations that I see less problematic sexual behavior is with the lesbian community.
Mhm.
Now, do you agree with that? And um, that friendships and emotional attachments are so fluid in that population.
Mhm.
Does that lend itself to problematic sexual behavior, or does it have really good boundaries?
Mm. That's a great question. And, you know, like you, I infrequently see lesbian couples struggle with like some of the betrayal and disclosures that come with chemsex or even, acting out that way. And I think it is to do with the emotional attachment, right? So I don't think when people are in partnership, especially in the lesbian community, I think they're less prone to problematic behavior around substances or sex because they have an emotional attachment bond that's very, very strong. Now, I will say the boundaries come with the enmeshment that I see oftentimes in lesbian relationships is there's very codependent, very enmeshed dynamic that I see a lot of folks really struggle with. So when
Mhm.
we talk about boundaries, maybe they're not outside boundaries of the relationship, but a lot of those boundary crossings actually happen within the relationship itself, right? So people
Mhm.
just become kind of lost in one another. And where I see kind of chemsex show up is when people aren't in relationships, right?
Okay.
When they
Mhm.
do not have that emotional bond or connection, um, or emotional attraction to another person, especially in the lesbian community, I see kind of this, I would say almost like toxic masculinity, like avoidance and shutdown happen in a lot of the lesbian community when people are not in relationships.
Okay, boy, now that really differentiates, and that would be my experience because I work with in relationships. So I'm already working with lesbian couples who are in relationship. I don't get to see many lesbians who aren't. So
Hmm.
that fits my environment and my dynamic, although very different. I'm in Florida today, but I'm also from Indianapolis.
Okay.
And two things happen in Indianapolis. One is it's a smaller LGBTQ community.
Hmm.
And also, when they find a therapist that's empathetic, that wants them to work together, that is non judgmental and compassionate, they tell everybody. So they're the evangelists for me
Hmm.
because they're so happy that somebody gets them uh, because there just aren't a lot of professionals that work in this field.
Hmm.
So I just wondered what you thought, because I had a feeling that you would have an answer for me that would make sense that I had not been aware of. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Now, truly, you already said that chemsex, it crosses, there are no real lines. It crosses boundaries all over the place.
Hmm.
But chemsex specifically can create moral injury. And and then you go on to say, and that moral injury can be different than shame or
Hmm.
post-traumatic stress.
Hmm.
So can you talk a little bit about that? To our listening audience, they may not know what a moral injury is.
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, thank you for the question because I think in the past 3 years, this has been really a big focus of my work is the self-betrayal that can occur in these chemsex settings. And when I think about moral injury, as I define it, it's, you know, acts of transgression, like maybe I entered into a perpetrator role when I was under the influence of substances, right? And then there's acts of omission, which is maybe I was in a chemsex setting and, I had used too many substances and maybe I saw someone being assaulted, but I couldn't move or I couldn't speak. I was completely maybe frozen because of the intoxication, but still I witnessed something that I would, in a sober frame of mind, never be okay with and speak out about. But because substances have just influenced my whole body and nervous system and placed me in a place of paralysis, I didn't say anything. I couldn't say anything. I was unable to say anything. So I think those are the top two definers when I look at moral injury is, how have you broken your own heart? I think is the question that comes to mind. Because when we get into chemsex settings, and I will say in the LGBTQ community, chemsex is predominantly with methamphetamine and GHB. And there's something very unique about when a person uses methamphetamine that's unlike any other drug. One, the potency of the drug. You're getting upwards of 1,500 to 2,000% increase in dopamine, right? So no other drug on the planet will release that much dopamine.
Uh-huh.
The second is methamphetamine eradicates emotional consciousness when you use it. So what happens is people, especially in minority populations or marginalized people, they have heavy burdens of toxic shame, maybe systemic abuse, maybe ongoing like body image struggles. So when you use meth, all of that is gone. But what is also gone is our ability to tap into a moral compass that defines what is right or wrong for us. I'm not talking about what the world says. We all have values, I think, that we kind of center on of what is okay and what's not okay. But when you're under the influence of substances, you cannot connect to that place. So I see a lot of people end up in dark places and spaces that create this moral injury or virtue injury. So things that are really outside of my moral compass become something that is on the table in these settings. And I don't have the register emotionally that would typically say, hey, I'm going left, you might want to turn right. That's not available. There's no like internal sense of direction towards virtue or moral. But what happens is when people come into recovery, they have to reconcile their own heartbreaking, their own self betrayal. Like, because I may have sober boundaries around my sexual behavior, but when those are out the window, I may find myself in a position of doing things I never imagined I would do because I'm under the influence and because I didn't have that moral register or witnessing things, right? That's another one. Or even being victimized and not being able to say anything. I work predominantly with gay men, and the Me Too is is a big struggle for people to come into. There's a lot of self-blame on the self-betrayal. And it's really hard, I think, especially for men to say, when I was in a chemsex setting, I was taken advantage of. You know, someone intentionally it gave me too much so they could assault me. So we have the perpetration, we have the paralysis of not being able to speak, and then we have the victimization. And I think those are kind of the three qualities that define moral injury. And moral injury was something that was actually studied in Vietnam veterans. Dr. Jonathan Day, Dr. Rita Brock, they are trailblazers in looking at moral injury because a lot of our veterans came back from Vietnam. They were, you know, the diagnostic was PTSD, right? Which is really event focused, which is there was an event, I have flashbacks, my nervous system is really dysregulated. But when it comes to things like a deep grief or a deep sorrow that come from self-betrayal, right? I think about people that go to war and they're instructed to do things, or maybe even, you know, having to kill someone. Like in my moral compass, if having to kill someone in order to protect myself was never a part of what I feel is right for me in this world, you come back with that injury and you will never not be the person that did that. And it's like, how do I integrate that in a way that practices self-compassion and self-forgiveness? So they started seeing in soldiers mainly sorrow. I think in PTSD, we don't have a diagnostic for the deep sorrow and heartbreak that comes with moral injury. And as a result of their research over the last 30 and 40 years, on September 17th, the DSM finally recognized moral injury as a diagnostic to diagnose people. So
That's
it is.
fantastic.
I like cried that day, Carol. I've been on this for 3 years because I think it's the ways we break our own hearts that stay with us the most, right?
Right.
Yeah, people have broken my heart.
Well, and Mel, I'm sitting here going, now, should I tell this story or not? But I'm going to because it speaks to moral injury. Um, I was looking for somebody to cater my birthday party, my 65th,
Mhm.
and I called my buddy. He's a restaurateur, a gay man. We rollerblade together. We have so much fun. And he says, well, don't use, I'll just, Tom Doe,
Mhm.
because he's the guy that dumped the body into your lake. And it was true. Several months before, they had found a dead body
Wow.
in our lake. And our lake backs up to a bar restaurant. And I think we all assumed somebody got close to the edge and rolled into the lake, and maybe was drunk enough that they did not recover.
Mhm.
But the story was that these four gay men had used chemsex, they used meth,
Mhm.
and he ended up doing too much. And they put the body in the car and took them 8 miles north, dumped the body in our lake.
Mhm.
And I said to my friend Mark, I said, Mark, you've got to call the police. You've got to. And he stopped me cold and he said, I've called the police 3 times. They don't care. And I thought, well, that's horrible. And I thought, what is that mentality? So that's that systemic, um, we pick our battles because now I was looking for a caterer in October, 2 months before the dead body thing came to be. And now it's a Christmas party in my own neighborhood. And a big, bold African American gay man who was in our neighborhood, I ran up to him and I said, "Hey," and that person was a prominent businessman
Hmm.
that was part of the group that dumped the body. And I go, "I know who dumped that body." And he goes, "Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. It was that restaurateur. We all know that, Carol." And I looked at him and I said, "Aren't you going to do anything?" And he said, "No, we pick and choose our cases." And it was pretty obvious to us that that wasn't a homicide and it
Hmm.
wasn't a suicide. It was
Mm-mm.
an accidental death. And although dumping a body is against the law,
Hmm.
we just pick our cases. And
Yeah.
I thought, I was heartbroken for the family that there wasn't the kind of investigation that needed to be done to at least put the pieces together for the family and the moral injury that you're talking about
Hmm.
of men in that car that were a part of it.
Hmm.
Um, the fact that this restaurateur is living now with the guilt of what happened and how horrendous that had to be. And
Yeah.
of course, the death of this young man.
Yeah.
Um, it, uh, it happens more than we think when
It
there is meth involved.
really, meth is one of the most toxic drugs, and it completely takes us offline from our senses of what's good and true and what's right and what is wrong. And I feel for men who were under the influence. This happened, and you know they clearly like dumped this person, but I wonder what happened for them when they got sober. I wonder what happened for them the next day, because it's not like you forget everything. Like
No
an alcohol,
amnesia.
right? There's no alcoholic blackout. There,
Right.
there is an awareness that transcends being under the influence and moves into sobriety. And what I see is there's a deep-seated shame that comes with this that prolongs people in addiction. Because who am I going to go to with that information, Carol? And
Mhm.
I see a lot of things, illicit and illegal material being shown in kind of these chemsex settings. But if you're the person that sees that, that witnesses that, you will never not be the person that didn't. And I find
Right.
it really difficult for people to come forward with actions or inactions that they took when they were under the influence and be able to talk about them in a safe setting and kind of process through some of the deep grief and sorrow, because this is an identity shift. More than anything, it's self-betrayal that leads to an identity shift, because those men that you are talking about will always know that they are the people who did that, right? And
Right.
mm, yeah.
Well, and I am a part of the death that occurred because I was a part of it and could do nothing but make a
Hmm.
bad choice because I was higher than a kite.
Yep.
And so, you said by far you feel like meth is the worst
Yeah.
chemsex drug
Hmm.
because of all the dopamine it produces, and then of course the judgment that is so very impaired, and the
Yeah.
moral injury that follows. Right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
What are some other drugs that frequently are involved when you say the word chemsex?
I mean, it can be anything, honestly. It can be, a gay man who's using meth and poppers to facilitate extended sexual sessions. It can be, a heterosexual cisgender man that needs to take opiates in order to hire an escort, right? Or it can be a cisgendered heterosexual woman that needs to drink before she's able to connect with her partner. So it's not discriminate. in the way that it functions and operates. And if you need substances and they are paired with sex, that equals sexualized drug use or chemsex. And, meth specifically, because of the increase in dopamine output, what starts to happen is there's a motivation issue, of course, because dopamine not only moves us forward and is euphoric, but it also imprints memory as well, right? Pleasurable memory. So I see people struggle a lot more with methamphetamine addiction and chemsex than anything else because your impulsivity is at a 10 and your visual memory, because of the way that moments or situations are imprinted into motivation and memory, your visual memory or even euphoric memory is also at a 10. So we have sensory memory at a 10, and then we have no impulse control or impulsivity at a 10. So it makes it very hard for people to recover because of the effects with meth. I see people have easier times recovering from chemsex if it's alcohol or if it's opiates or anything else, cocaine, anything like that. But meth and one of the hardest to recover from.
Okay, if you're just tuning into your podcast, we're talking to Mel McCracken, who is the National Director of Chemsex and LGBTQ population. And she is an educator. She is an author, treatment developer. She is Johnny on the spot to really help organizations, professionals, and clients understand what is happening to them. And Mel, one of the reasons I think that I've been so successful is because so much of what I do is psychoeducation about how the brain gets hijacked and neurocircuitry development and neurology in general. And, you're looking at this from a very scientific place. I mean, you recognize that chemsex can arouse and actually rewire arousal and sexuality and all the arousal templates that one might have. Can you tell us a little bit more about how is chemsex so powerful that it can rewire an arousal template?
I mean, such a great follow-up question from what we were just kind of talking about is when I am working with clients, I will kind of differentiate between what is a standing arousal template in, my sober life, maybe pre-substances, into what may be a chemsex arousal template. Because the things that might arouse me or I might be attracted or drawn to under the influence become wildly different than who I know myself to be when I am engaging in my sober arousal template or my factory settings, right? And chemsex has a way of rewiring this, again, dependent on the substance. And when we think about methamphetamine specifically, that is going to rewire what you're attracted to, maybe, and it's very sensory driven, right? So a lot of the chemsex arousal template will be based on, visual memory. It will be based on like clothing items, smell,
Kinesthetic.
all of that, any sort of sensory interaction that someone has had while they're using chemsex, that becomes something that sits on their chemsex arousal template. And whether that's apps or websites or paraphernalia, items of clothing, that imprint is so high because meth is a sensory drug, right? Unlike any other drug. Right? So it really engages you in your senses. So anything that was happening there sits on your arousal template, your chemsex arousal template. Now, in the beginning, especially when I'm helping people who are struggling with methamphetamine, it's important that you eliminate all of those type of triggers, right? Because that memory comes back so quickly. I've had people sit in recovery meetings and they've been using a hookup app grinder in their chemsex settings. be completely off of the apps, completely off the websites, completely protect themselves and kind of bubble wrap their recovery in the beginning, hear a notification go off and leave the recovery meeting and relapse. So,
Mhm.
like, that is just the power and the potency of that visual memory and euphoric recall that induces, cravings that I think a lot of people have no tools to withstand, especially around the impulsivity, right? No thought between the action, right? And that's just because
Mhm.
you don't have the ability. You haven't been able to kind of grow that prefrontal cortex to give you a little bit of space between what you're thinking and the action if there's a trigger. Color schemes, like even things like that, sit on the chemsex arousal template. There can be other things that are not aligned with sober values that show themselves in chemsex arousal templates. Like I was saying, maybe illicit or illegal things, once they're seen under the influence, start to sit in there. And people really struggle with the self identity of like, well, this is what happened to me. Then that must be who I am, right? I see this question come up a lot, and so for me, it's important to help people understand that you you're operating from two different arousal templates at this point. You have the one that's been rewired by substances, but then you have your factory settings. And it's almost like factory settings are kind of the hardware, and I would say chemsex is more the software. So we have to uninstall the software to
Mhm.
return to the hardware.
And that
Um,
takes a long time, and a lot of fortitude and a lot of discipline and a lot of support.
yes, yes.
Hmm.
I would say on average, I mean, the brain doesn't really even recover from methamphetamine addiction between, 14 months and, 2 years, right?
I was going to
So,
say 5.
I mean, yeah, like for
Mhm.
some people, depends on how you use, when you use, how long you use. I mean, it really varies. But I am not shy about giving people that information because, like,
No.
I want them to know this, right? I'm not going to pretend that your recovery is going to happen after 90 days or even 6 months or even a year. This is that ongoing support system, that ongoing psychoeducation, that ongoing therapy, whatever you're needing in that duration, right? So
Right.
I appreciate that you mentioned the time that it does take to recover because it's so long and people
Well,
underestimate it.
and that's why in recovery they say a day at a time, because if you think 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, I won't make it. But if you say, I'll do it one day at a time, I have
Hmm.
two personal questions to ask you.
Sure.
One is, have you met Patrick Carnes, the founder of ITAP, that obviously created the institute to help people with problematic sexual behaviors find professionals?
Yes, I have met Dr. Carnes, I think in passing at an ITEP symposium. But before then, Patrick Carnes actually did my mod 4. So it was such a pleasure to get to hear him speak, and the way he talks about sexual recovery is unmatched, right?
Uh-huh. Well,
And
I
so
asked that because he was talking about chemsex when I went through ITAP in 2007. And he told us, and he probably told you all too, that we were going to have to be brain scientists to really do this field justice, that it wasn't necessarily a moral issue, problematic sexual behavior, chemsex, things like that. It was how the brain had been wired and how we could help to unwire that brain. And so I wondered if he ever met you, and it sounds like you've run into each other, but he doesn't know who you are. I mean,
yeah,
doesn't.
I know, like Dr. Stephanie Carnes, like her and I have had like so many wonderful conversations. But I think when I entered into the ITAP world, I was fortunate enough to have Patrick in Mod 4. He was kind of stepping out and letting, Stephanie kind of start to step into the light a little bit more and direct kind of how we treat sex addiction, right? And of
Mhm.
course, that makes total sense to me because Patrick Carnes is, the original. So,
Well, I am going to send him a note and tell him that he needs to have a conversation with you because we are so lucky to have
Mhm,
you as part of ITAP. You are doing such incredible work and you're doing it and you're taking the shame out of it.
mhm,
And it sounds like, obviously, in our field with sex addiction and problematic sexual behavior, shame is just the coat everyone wears. But you now can multiply that 1,000 times based on that fusion
mhm.
of what chemsex is. I want to ask you, your last question is, what would you tell the many, many professionals
Mhm.
and family members that are dealing with this? What would you tell them about this field, about your work, about their work?
I I think of like 25 different bullet points that I would love to convey. And I think that as we move into understanding the impact of problematic sexual behavior on the brain, the impact of chemsex, um, the moral failure is obviously moving further away from our field, and we are definitely getting more into the neuroscience of addiction. But I see a lot of well meaning folks unintentionally actually create more shame. And I will tell you that it is from internalized biases, right, that have gone
Mhm,
unchecked, unnoticed.
mhm,
Um, it is from misunderstanding that delicate line of holding someone accountable while not reinforcing shame, right? And that is such a tightrope walk of like, I want you to own your actions, I want you to be accountable, and I know that you need to do this in order to have a full breath of recovery.
mhm.
However, I can't make you do that. And I find people kind of pushing for that, that almost compounds the shame without
Mhm.
actually looking at the shame first and then moving towards the accountability, right? Because, a lot of actions that we take under the influence require self forgiveness and self compassion first.
Oh,
Or
and
else,
that's, go
yeah,
ahead.
I was going to
Well, I was
say,
just
like,
sitting here thinking, I mean, you've got two major biases and experiences hitting the wall. You have a marginalized society
mhm,
who has had um, so many impasses, so many things that they were fighting against,
yeah,
and that would create a propensity to want to medicate and to want to numb out and to want to forget for a little while how hard it was to go to school, how hard it was to be bullied, how hard
yes,
it was to um, just be themselves.
right,
And then, in addition, they choose the medicine of
mhm,
choice, their cocktail of choice, and the attachment they're wanting that so oftentimes may come from a relationship initially, but also has lots of transactional features,
yes,
making it creating shame. And so
hmm,
you've got so much work to do. And, I hope our listening audience now has a better appreciation for what chemsex is. I know I do. But I also want you to know that although anybody can be subject to chemsex, this is a population where we really have to open our hearts,
hmm,
not judge, have self-compassion for them,
hmm,
and do our best to do what Mel said, or I should say, not do what Mel said, and not make them feel guilty for their choices. Give them the hope that they will be able to figure it out with good
hmm,
treatment centers, and
yeah.
the education that you're providing all of us today and everywhere you go.
Yeah. And I mean, like, even speaking about the complexities of systemic oppression in marginalized communities, like the moment, well, I will speak for myself, and this is a
Okay.
lot of the moment that I discovered my differentness was the moment a split began. And that split looks like I was 6 years old in the second grade, and I was drawn to Miss Hermes like nobody else, but I didn't see that anywhere else. So
Mhm.
the secret identity began so early on, and it's
Mhm.
so ingrained, and it is without thought that I respond that way, right? All of these protective parts started to grow in front of me in order to try and hide who I really was. Now, that was not effective as we got through high school, and like you said, like bullying or slurs or just homophobia in general. I grew up in a very unfriendly area. um, that kind of continued in that pattern of pretending.
Mhm.
I see, that moves far into adulthood for a lot of people, and many people during their prime adolescence, which is, I never had an opportunity to tell anyone who I had a crush on, to take anyone out on a date. Like anything that I was doing was very secretive, right? Any exploration that would be a natural adolescent exploration, I could never be upfront about it. So when we're looking at this community, it's important to understand that there is a big split that happens for a lot of people of intimacy and friendships and then sex. So that begins very early on. And I see this kind of, not only producing this cycle of secretive shame-based sex behaviors, but you also want to throw in some fear there, because if I'm being bullied and anyone found this out, I'm going to go into a panic and think my life is threatened. So you kind of
Mhm.
have this post-traumatic stress fear response where there's a threat to your life as you're living. And that also, that those complexities are really something that we address in treatment. And just to speak to like kind of the environment that is happening for a lot of people today is a big reminder and a big flashback to where we were in the 80s, in the 90s, even the early 2000s, as far as rhetoric, homophobic slurs, transphobic slurs, exclusion. That's happening today. So if you turn on the TV and you're a person like me and you see 563 bills being put up against your community in one year, can you imagine what that might bring back to the surface for a lot of people?
Oh, flashback city for sure.
That's
So
right.
we have to end. I think that was a beautiful depiction of what I was saying, and I want to remind everybody I'm talking to Mel McCracken, and if you would like to get a hold of her, her email is Mel with two L's
Mhm.
at no matter what recovery.com, or you can go to her website, which is the same www.nomatterwhatrecovery.com. It has been a pleasure, Mel. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me, Carol. And if I can just offer kind of a shameless plug, I
Yeah, please
I run
do.
I run a free drop-in group worldwide on Wednesdays at 4 p.m. Pacific time. So if there's any clinician out there that is looking for added support for maybe a client that they're working with, this is a very valuable free resource that just focuses on chemsex. And we have a great community, and you can drop in anytime and drop out. I know Dr. Fawcett also has a Tuesday group that's free. So I think just bringing awareness to some of the resources that are available is really important to me. So you can go to, our website, you can email me directly, and I can send you all of the information for the free drop-in group.
I am so glad you said that because it was that free drop-in group that I said I wanted to announce on my podcast because first of all, you don't get a free support group, a free drop-in group with a professional.
Mhm.
Secondly, there is such a stigma and shame to this to be able to have a community of people that can talk about this wherever they're at is incredible. And thirdly, when I asked Patrick Carnes what is the most valuable thing I can do as a CSAT for my community? He said, start a group where they can talk to each other. And so again, Mel McCracken, you're on to something. Thank you so much. And it's Wednesday night, and they can contact you to find out more about it.
Yep, Wednesdays at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, and it's every Wednesday. And please reach out to me. Even if like you have questions and you want to consult or anything like that, I'm so open to handing over, anything that I have found in working with this population that brings people back to their center. So, thank you.
Well, that wasn't a shameless plug. That was a gift and a blessing. So thank you so much. And if you will email me that information, I'll make sure it gets in the show notes too. Okay?
You got it. Yes. Awesome.
Okay. Say hello to all of our good friends, and I'll see you soon at the next symposium.
Oh, yes, definitely. See you soon, Carol. Thank you so much for having me today.
Save me a seat.
You got it. So,
Okay. Bye.
uh,